Welcome to Cloud Dialogues episode 8. Hey Georgia, how are you this evening? Well, it's morning for me,
Hey,
evening for you.
yep, yep. We're opposites as usual. I'm good. I had the weekend in Milan and now I have returned.
Yeah, Milan's nice. Italy's nice, the food's nice,
Lovely
so you probably filled yourself up.
and sunny, just nice and sunny.
Sunny, a little bit different to London.
Even though it was cold, it was sunny
Yeah,
and there was no wind.
really, just nice,
Not
interesting.
really, not really any wind. I went for a run tonight in London and I felt like the wind was pushing me around my track. I was like, yeah,
Yeah.
thank you.
Uh, today
So good.
we today we are introing serverless to our listeners. So it's been a topical area for the last few years. I think a lot of executives, especially, think it's some mysterious thing, and maybe a lot of people have heard about it but don't know what it is. So we'll dive into what makes serverless tick and why it's suited to many business needs and why executives should be investing in their teams to reskill into serverless. It's developing a specific mindset in the way to solve problems. So, in the past, developers have had to do a lot of glue code and a lot of development that was not directly related to solving the problem that they have to solve. So, it's not about reskilling so much as developing a serverless mindset on how to solve problems. And with serverless, it's about understanding the cloud provider and the services they provide and how to use those managed services to solve a particular problem at hand and remove all the requirement for developing glue code and all those extraneous things that developers have to do to get their app up and running. And examples are dealing with, APIs and dealing with queues and having to manage databases and all those sorts of things. And there's many people think serverless is still new and not many people do it, but there's plenty of examples documented out in the wild where people are
Yeah, out in the
successful
wild.
out in the wild, like the animals, that where people are
Lions and
successful.
tigers and bears. And I think for a lot of executives, Matt, it's just another thing that they need to do. Even just the different hyperscalers. If you're dealing with one and you have to start dealing with another one, oh my goodness. Like,
Exactly.
oh, and I feel like a lot of executives hear about serverless and they're like, oh, it's just a whole other thing. But I think just like with cloud, there are use cases that are greatly suited to serverless.
Yeah.
And where that is the case, if we have the opportunity to use it, we should. But just like cloud, there will be times when it's not the best option.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. We'll cover some good use cases and maybe some not. A lot of things that happen in enterprise, especially, are definitely well suited to serverless. So, next episode, we have Joe Emerson from Branch, which is an insurance company in the US, and he is a textbook case on developing a fully serverless insurance company and the operating model around that. He'll discuss how he does that with no ops team, how he develops his application, and you know, getting that information out there. I think is important because people need specific use cases to be able to
Examples, yeah, to
examples.
understand how it's working.
Exactly.
We're super excited to have Joe.
Yep.
I'm super excited to have Joe. I think bringing that serverless conversation to life, you have to talk about operating model.
Exactly. And it's a different, again, along with the serverless mindset from a developer perspective, the operating model is also a mind shift.
Absolutely.
So that'll be
Yeah, and obviously
interesting.
that's the goal of the next couple of episodes. This one and the next one is we're going to learn all about serverless and how to work on serverless.
Yep. And what makes it tick. And we'll also cover the term
Yay.
event driven. Event driven sort of goes with serverless as well. and the business benefits around security, scaling, and more. So let's dive in. So I'll, before I describe what serverless is, let's just briefly discuss the business IT landscape. So up until a few years ago, even before cloud, organisations built VMs, purchased software, installed software for every single part of their business, even the parts that were not really differentiating their business.
So I think that we went from on-prem to cloud,
Yep.
right? So like looking a few, well, hopefully most organizations went from, if there was use cases for it, which for most organizations there would be, going from on-prem to cloud. And now we're talking about another paradigm shift, which is going from cloud to having virtual machines in the cloud,
Yep.
someone else's data center, right? So we're going from our data center to someone else's data center to, oh, actually, there is no data center for the
Yep.
most part, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And obviously, that's a whole shift in the way of thinking as organizations and the way of working as an organizations, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And being able to, well, they take the next step. So people have developed, have moved into the cloud, treated it as a data center, but then they've started to move on to the journey of taking on software as a service
More
to
cloud
solve
native.
cloud native things for
Yeah.
parts of their business that don't differentiate them. For example, identity and accounting and some of those things that you need in your business, but you don't want to develop those systems. You don't want to purchase software. You don't want to manage software to deal with them. You want to use as many pre-canned solutions as possible. And the pre-canned solutions are usually fairly general, but that's okay because it's solving the same problem for everyone. A business exists to solve a particular problem, a particular use case. And that's where their differentiator is. And that's where they have software developers to solve that problem. And that's why you, as an executive, have your software dev teams hopefully solving the right problems that makes your business count and unique, and why people choose your particular business for whatever they do.
And that's why serverless can be so advantageous, right? Now we're not worried about setting up virtual machines. We're not worried about infrastructure as a service, not even worried about platform as a service.
That's
We're
right.
purely worrying about the events that
The
are
event, yeah,
involved.
and so instead of developing software on VMs, and then the next level was developing software on platform as a service, you're solving problems by writing. So serverless itself is actually made up of two different things. You have your business logic code, which gets executed in, like a AWS Lambda or Azure function, and that runs your code and that's it, and then it goes away. And that could be really quick, right? But that happens a lot. So all your, used to be a big monolithic application, and now it's distributed. Your business logic is distributed into different functions that get called based on events. And
And when you say event, Matt, because I feel like to some people that might not be entirely clear.
yep.
What does that mean? What's an event?
So I'll give an example. When you send an API to a server, as soon as your browser hits that server, an event is sent to that server saying, send me this data. So the server responds by running some code, which sends the data back. That's as simple as it gets. And that event is effectively a payload which has some information in it on the request, and then it gets a response back, and then the browser does something with that. So ultimately, that's all an event is. I was saying serverless is made up of two things. There was the function that runs the code, but the other part is the managed services that your cloud provider provides to solve particular problems. So you don't have to write code for everything. So you have an API gateway to deal with APIs. You don't have to write an API. In the past, people had to write their own a lot of the time wrote their own API servers and things like that. And now it's all about using the managed provider to solve those problems like queues and which is sending messages around to different systems and things like that. So it's about utilizing the cloud provider for what they're good at, and they manage all those components. So ultimately, the developer, all they have to do is think about their application. They can model out their events. They can then work out what code they need to write based on the problem that they're solving. So that's kind of serverless in a very high level nutshell. And the benefit of just writing the business logic is that there's no VM to manage, there's no patching, there's no underlying components that anyone has to look after. They just have to operate their code and manage their code. Their code dependencies they still have to manage, but they've always had to do that anyway. So that part doesn't really go away, but
I
ultimately
feel like
there's less
the
code
great
to look
thing
after.
about serverless is that it's an opportunity to be closer to the customers that we serve,
Yep.
right? Whether you're like a developer creating internal systems or like and your teams are your customers, or whether you're working for a financial services organization and you're managing some sort of externally facing application like banking, for example. It's like, okay, well, when we think about how we interact with our customers, what exactly does that look like? Because that will derive that event model like quite explicitly, right? As opposed to like, oh, we've got this whole stack of infrastructure that we need to manage. And most of it our customer doesn't care about,
Yeah, that's right.
right?
Exactly.
Most of it our customer doesn't care about at all, except for maybe this little bit on the top of the stack, right?
Yeah, which is where the business differentiator is, right? And
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
that's the part that people care about, that their transaction is done, whatever the customer needs to be done is done quickly, reliably, and available most of the time. Like, when you go to government websites on the weekend, oh, sorry, we're down for the next 2 days because we're doing
It's
maintenance.
unreal. It's unreal.
And
Like,
that in this day and age, but having to deal with that is ridiculous. And the reason why it has to be down for 2 days is because they're dealing with the old ways of, they might be upgrading their operating system and having
yeah,
the extra
it's
time,
madness.
yeah,
Yeah.
to deal with that. So
And
the,
like thinking from that perspective, Matt, when you think about things that I know, obviously you're a big advocate for serverless, but when you hear about different workloads and different things that organizations are doing and building, what do you think have been the best cases for serverless that you have seen? Like, where do you hear about an application or a stack or whatever, and you think that should be serverless?
a lot of the time it's those APIs, back end APIs. Even today, people still use the alternative. A lot of people still use containers for that sort of thing.
Right.
And while containers, some people call containers serverless, I don't. They're better than VMs. So a VM is a huge,
It's an
long.
improvement.
A
It's like a
VM is
scale of modernization,
exactly
right?
right. Yeah,
It's
uh,
like just having servers not in your data center, but in AWS's data center or Azure's or whatever. And then there's like maybe containers, and then there's like serverless.
exactly. So you have the VM that's there. It's a long running host that stays there for a long time and has to be maintained. Containers improve that a lot because they're shorter lived, they're smaller, but you still have to maintain containers. They still, got a lot of components that you have to
Well, you still
update
need
and
to do lots of
manage,
patching.
and you still have to redeploy them with updated patches because there's still components in there that,
And then if you're
you have to
managing a
deal with.
fleet of them, you need to manage your fleet,
And
right?
you're
And
yeah,
make
you got to
sure that
orchestrate
things
them.
like FinOps, all these sorts of things they require ongoing management, and just
That's
even
right.
just regular patching and security updates on these types of systems.
Yeah, yeah. Containers are an improvement, but a lot of the time they can be replaced by just functions to do this business logic for the APIs and things like that. So APIs are a great use case. A lot of front end apps. almost every front end web application that you use in your browser will have some sort of API in the back end, and almost always those can be serverless, no worries. Things like if you're doing long running machine learning tasks, training, those sorts of things are not really suited for serverless because the backends have usually a limited time that these functions can run.
Right.
So they're usually not, but they're more specific. There might be specific workloads that have long running tasks that aren't really suited for serverless, or sometimes that's changing as well, depending on how long they have to run. Especially with these larger models, the tuning sometimes doesn't take too long. It depends on what you're doing. But yeah, in general, most of those patterns, even video streaming, all those sorts of things, are absolutely suited to serverless.
And I think one thing as well, Matt, that we've kind of spoken about before, and people might have missed this, we spoke about it briefly last year, is like sometimes when we talk about serverless products, it's like things that are genuinely serverless and things that are perhaps not quite like appear as serverless, but
Exactly.
perhaps are
Yes.
not.
Yep.
What's the
Yep.
difference?
So the difference between that is ultimately a scaling to zero. So what I mean by that is that when your serverless function runs, you get charged, say, basically for the time it runs and how much memory it uses. Usually
Yeah,
that's the metric, and it might be 300 milliseconds. You get charged, a fraction of a cent for that particular run, and as soon as that function stops, you don't get charged
you're
anything.
not getting charged
Yeah,
anymore.
and that's the difference between containers and
You
VMs.
can scale to zero.
Yeah, you can't. Yeah, with VMs, it's always running, so you're always being charged. With containers, they're usually running for a lot longer, even if they're not doing anything. Sometimes they're just sitting there. So you're still being charged for that compute. The compute might be cheaper for a container, but you're still being charged for it. For a serverless system, usually you get charged nothing if it's not doing anything. And I say usually because sometimes there's managed services that don't scale to zero. There's a whole
Right.
raft of different things.
Just released something last year. I think there was insinuating that it was serverless, but when we dug into it, it was
Yeah,
like it doesn't scale to
there
zero because
there was
that's the
the
requirement,
yeah.
right? Within the community, what's generally accepted as serverless is things that scale to zero.
Yes, that's correct. So an example there was, I think it was Aurora Serverless a couple of years back when
Mm,
it got released. It scaled down, but didn't really.
but
There
not to
was,
zero.
yeah,
Yeah, right.
that's slowly improving.
Lies.
Lies, but it's still better than.
Lies.
Sometimes it's still better
It's an
than
improvement.
the alternative. Yes, but there's a lot of serv- databases out there that there's a lot of innovation happening in the database space. There's one got released recently called NileDB. I haven't looked into it. It's like a serverless Postgres
Interesting. I haven't
type
heard about that
DB.
either. Matt, and I think one of the key drivers for serverless is cost, right?
Yep, yep.
In terms of cost, like what are the biggest benefits that you've seen? Like how impactful do you think it actually can be?
From a cost perspective, it's massive because usually you're paying, hundreds of dollars for a VM per. It could even be per month, depending on the size of the VM, right? And a lot of the time, it's just sitting there idle, and it's actually costing you a lot of money because you have to manage that VM as well. Whereas with serverless, it could be in like dollars per month to run the same workload, and that's probably a heavy workload compared to hundreds of
Wow.
dollars. So it's
Yeah,
significantly
right.
different. But it's not even that. It's the thing that people forget is that with a proper cost attribution, so you've got your tags and everything set up properly, even for the parts of the application that the function serves, you can actually get an attribution for the makeup of your application, from
Yeah, that's
the
what I was
user
wondering.
journey from the beginning to
Yeah.
end.
Right.
So your
Right.
CFO can see which
Like so
parts,
at like an event level.
yeah, at event level. So you can see
Wow.
what the
Is
makeup
costing
of your
what?
application is and what parts of the
Wow.
application cost more than others, which you would never be able to get running on a
that level of
monolithic VM.
granularity.
Yeah,
No, yeah, right. I didn't realize that the like FinOps advantages could be that
yeah, and
significant.
as long and usually you're forced to do all the tagging properly, and even if you're not doing the tagging properly, even if you got it per function name, you could work out, you could sort your functions by biggest user, and then suddenly you can see where your optimizations, could be and things like that. And it's it's a different mindset, and it's the visibility that executives have never really had in the past of their applications and their business differentiators. So basically it means if you've used SaaS, you know your cost for your SaaS components, your managed
Yeah.
components, like that's all fixed. You know what that cost is. So you can put that to the side. You get that full visibility for all the other parts, and it also helps with performance. So it's not just cost, but you can see, where things are spending a lot of
You don't
time,
have
where
that
things
big
can be
stack of
optimized.
stuff
That's right. And it
that's
really,
supporting whatever it is that you're doing.
containers give that visibility too, as long as you're not running monolithic containers. So they sort of help a little bit because containers,
Monolithic containers.
which sometimes people do, hundreds of
That
megabytes.
sounds like an oxymoron.
That is, but people do it. Some of the Windows containers can be like a gigabyte.
Wow.
But and yeah, it's better than a VM, but you know, you still got to pay for all that storage. Oh, that's
You're
the other thing that
consuming all of those resources.
yeah. Oh, I forgot to mention around serverless, around storage as well, like blocks, object storage like S3 and Azure Blob. That's all serverless, right? Because you're only getting charged for anything you put in there and any time you take data out. As
Yes.
soon as you remove, as long as you're not pulling data out of your storage, you're not being charged. You're only being
I'm
charged
charged
for
for
what's
it.
being stored there.
Yeah.
And then if you delete it all, obviously your charges stop. So it's using all those components and data managed databases. Sometimes serverless databases are a little bit rarer. A good example is DynamoDB on AWS. You only get charged for the data that you put in that database and to be able to get data out. But if you're not getting data out, again, you're just being charged for the storage, similar to the serverless storage like blob storage. So using all those components together helps you get a full application up and running, and you know exactly where your costs are.
Matt, obviously we've spoken about that the having using serverless, it helps bring developers closer to the customer that they're developing for. But in terms of stickly adapting to changing business requirements and markets, how do you see it being advantageous?
It allows you to easily update your application, take something that you've built for a specific purpose, and then if your organization needs to pivot, you can easily do that without having to redevelop the whole thing and then just pick the
Adjust all the
parts.
underlying
Yeah,
infrastructure. Yeah,
you just have
right.
to
Okay.
and you can just redevelop for that new market or new problem, take away, and you don't have to worry about standing up all that underlying infrastructure again. You can reuse a lot of that logic because a lot of it will be general, and you just have to pivot the business logic for that new market. If something's not working, then you can do that pivoting very easily. And the serverless development in the past has been a little bit complicated to debug, but it's getting better. There's a lot of tools out there that can help make that a little easier to iterate through the development cycle, especially if you do a lot of test driven development and a lot of running a lot of tests during your development cycle. So you don't have to. The hardest part about serverless is testing it in the cloud because you can't usually run it locally that as easily as running it
Of
in your cloud
course.
provider
Yeah.
because it's part of your cloud provider's DNA to provide all those services. And if you run it
Yes.
locally, you don't get the full experience necessarily.
And obviously, we talk a lot about the shared responsibility model and how it pertains to different products and services in cloud. But in terms of shared responsibility for serverless, and things like security and compliance, how is it different to managing other products?
Especially around security, again, similar to cost, there's a huge benefit around security. And the security is that you can get really fine grained controls on your application and your business logic on what it can do. When you have a VM, you have really wide permissions. It can, a lot of the time, it can do anything because it's a lot more complicated to restrict what's running on a VM to a specific thing or what it can access. Because the VM probably does a whole heap of different things, right? So you've got to let it do all those things. With a function, I can read from this object storage. That's it. That's the only permission it has. So, or I can write to this object storage, or you can have, and the real benefit comes when you have to encrypt data. So you could have one particular function that puts data somewhere and encrypts it, but it can't read that data. And then you can have another workflow that reads the data by getting the key to be able to decrypt the data. So you're separating responsibility in different areas. In the past, the VM would have to be able to do both things, or you'd have to have multiple VMs separated to be able to do the secure write and encryption and the secure read and decryption. So serverless allows you to really tighten up those security controls and have really fine grained controls on what that particular business logic can do. And that's big from a security perspective. Obviously, the other part of that is that you don't have to worry about operating level operating system vulnerabilities or things like that, because the operating system is taken care of in serverless by your cloud provider. So all those things are taken care of. The only security vulnerability thing that the developer or organization has to take care of is the modules that they use to develop their application and make sure they're current. And cloud providers have tools to be able to inspect these things and give alerts when there's specific high risk vulnerabilities appear in the serverless function. An example is AWS Inspector, because it'll alert if specific Lambda code, for example, is vulnerable to a current vulnerability, and then someone has to go and fix that up and redeploy the function with the latest modules to be able to fix that up. So, yeah, lots of benefits for security, for sure.
One thing I want to ask about as well is obviously, Matt, you have had your head in the clouds for a number of years now, but how that's the
Great
second
joke.
time this year. So good. But how did you learn serverless? Because that's what I think a lot of when executives think about different skill sets and there's all these advantages to going serverless, right? And particularly for executives that are like looking after particular front end functions that are doing important things for their customers. It's like, okay, how do we cut out all this other infrastructure related work that our teams are doing and have them focused on developing things for our customers? There's so many benefits, but how do they actually get, because I don't think there are lots of people out there that are specifically skilled for serverless. There are a
No.
few people that I know, but it's not a massive market, right? How do organizations look to skill for something like serverless? How did you get there?
It's actually takes a whole shift. I don't know.
Mindset shift?
That's it. Mindset shift. Um, it's too early in the morning, and it requires experimentation. Like for quite a while, when Lambda came out 10 years ago this year, right? 2014.
Really?
Yeah,
Lambda is 10 years old. I feel like
almost.
Lambda is one of the best products that AWS has.
Yeah, and then all the other cloud providers followed with their own specific versions, but they all achieve the same outcome. Ultimately, it's a very simple. It takes an input, an event, runs some code, and provides an output to whoever requested the thing. And
Yeah.
the way I understood it and where it finally clicked for me was thinking about the serverless function like a stored procedure in a database. And for those who don't know what a stored procedure in a database is, database stores a whole bunch of stuff. Whenever you insert or delete or create a table, and they're events. So whenever a database receives an event, you can have code that runs on that database to deal with that event, which might be updating other tables or doing some sort of business logic in some weird SQL language. That's ultimately what a function is. And for me, that's what clicked in my mind on what serverless was. And then as more managed infrastructure came online by the cloud providers, like API Gateway was soon after Lambda, things like that. API Gateway was already around, but Lambda couldn't talk to it. And then once
Right.
Lambda could talk to API Gateway, then it was very clear that APIs were a really great way to be able to deal with serverless functions. So as long as you're a developer who knows how to code, you have to forget what you've learned about glue code and templated applications. And for example, Microsoft ASP.NET is their web service thing to be able to deal with web requests for web applications. A lot of that code in those templates is not needed from a serverless perspective. It's all dealt with at that provider level. So just getting your head around the fact that you don't need a lot of that glue code is partly on the way, and the other part is experimentation. And all the cloud providers provide a lot of serverless examples in their training materials. And if I was an executive, I'd be making sure my teams would be learning that, spending some time to learn that material, solve small problems in the organization, and then build up that skill set to be able to have that serverless mindset when they're building their applications. And eventually people will get it and understand it. And all the cloud providers provide people and training, and a lot of it's free. Even your solutions architect will come and do a day-long immersion on serverless. And that is enough to pique a lot of people's interest. And it makes development fun again because all the boring stuff is taken care of. And it's the interesting stuff that's left behind that you're writing code for.
Make developing great again.
Exactly. A lot of
We should make a hat. We should make a hat. Make developing great again. Go serverless.
maybe that could be part of the title.
That's for Amazon and Azure if you're listening. One other thing that I wanted to ask you about, Matt, I know a lot of organizations, especially in the public sector, have a lot of concerns around like probity and making sure that they're not locking themselves into certain
Yep.
vendors. Obviously, Lambda and what's Azure's
Azure
one?
Functions.
Obviously, Lambda and Azure Functions, there's a certain level of customization that has to be done to either make it work on Lambda or make it work on Functions.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on that? Is there a way to avoid vendor lock-in with serverless, or is it something that we haven't really achieved yet?
So it's shifting out cost. Shifting out cost is basically I've developed my app for AWS and that
Mm-hmm.
platform. What's my cost to shift out and develop it for Azure? To minimize that shifting out, you've always got a shifting out cost for everything that you put in place.
Mm-hmm.
To minimize that shifting out cost, as long as you write your functions in a maintainable fashion and your business logic code is not going to change wherever it runs. How it runs, that changes. So
Yeah.
the part where the event comes in, deals with the event, pulls the information out, that might be a different structure depending on the cloud providers, but you can
Okay.
abstract that away when you're building it out. Your business logic is going to be the same no matter where it runs. So to
Right.
minimize your shifting out cost, you do not write your huge functions with a whole bunch of vendor provided code. You keep your vendor provided code separate and your business logic will stay the same. So that's the key to be able to minimize that cost. And then as your second part of your question around how do I fail over between cloud providers, well, that actually, if your business case means that you need to run the same thing in two different
It's probably not for
hyperscalers,
serverless.
well, no, you can. So if the business case stacks up, then you can run that logic in two different cloud providers. You've just got to do double the work to be at the start to be able to deal with those vendor provided APIs at the beginning,
Yeah.
and you still have to work out, do I need to have two different APIs in two different cloud providers, or you've got to break your application out, figure out which parts are the
Mm.
most likely to fail.
Hmm.
Ideally, you probably want to always run in one, and then if you need to fail over, you set up your infrastructure to fail over to the other, as long as you've built the application and the business case says that it's worth doing that. A lot of the time for a specific application, that's usually not required except in extreme circumstances.
Totally.
So that's there's a whole probably a whole episode on vendor locking there. So maybe we should put that on the backlog.
Yeah, probably. I think it's something a lot of organizations worry about. And I always think once you get to the bottom of it, like once you really understand more about cloud, you probably won't really worry about it.
No, no, because
But
you've
at the
you've already
same
invested.
time,
Yeah,
yeah, but at the same time, I guess a lot of executives are under pressure to like explain these things,
yeah, that's true.
especially in the public sector where perhaps things are not as innovative.
Yeah, it's a bit hard. It's a bit harder there for a lot of things, right? But being able to articulate that shift out cost and develop it in a specific way, that's the key. And it's actually, it just takes a bit of thinking and planning, and it's not that much of an issue. Especially if you're going all in on AWS, then you have probably bigger things that you need to deal with rather than the specific, you know, serverless function. So yeah, I think we've covered pretty much everything I wanted to discuss.
Seriously.
Cool. So that was a fun conversation. Thanks for joining us and listening or watching. We seem to get a lot more YouTube viewers these days.
I love YouTube.
Don't forget
I
to
really think
smash the like
I
button.
like, well, it's nice that people can see our faces, you know?
Yeah. And depending
I
on
like
our
that.
recording provider, the quality will be high or low depending on the week, but hopefully that becomes a bit more
Fingers crossed.
consistently good.
Fingers
So
crossed.
we like feedback at cloud-dialogues.com, and we have a form on our website if you want to give feedback that way. Until next time, where we'll talk about specifically a use case around the serverless operating model. See you then. See
Who's
you,
our
Georgia.
guest, Matt?
Joe
Who's our
Emerson.
guest?
Joe Emerson from Branch, which is an insurance company in the US.
Okay, did we say that?
We have now.
Okay, so we've got. Do you want
Yeah.
to say it again so it's like camera ready?
So till next time, see you then.